actually really grateful to you for being here. And I think so. We're gonna cover a bunch of different topics. There's going to be. I'm going to start off with asking you about your journey, and that just setting the scene for everyone, and then going into some questions that enabled you to do what you did and what you've learned from that, and how you think that what you've learned through that journey and process can potentially help others along theirs. So if we can just start with that, if you can give us just essentially an intro into your business journey. 16, I mean, that's pretty young to start thinking about business. Most people are focused on their GCSEs, but if you could give us an idea of that and where that, was triggered from, and then just go from there and just bring us up to today, and then we'll go from there.
Brilliant. Well, thank you for having me. Firstly, I am very, very grateful because I'm normally sat in the audience enjoying these events, so it's interesting to be sat here. So, I guess going back to the start of the journey, really, it was the quintessential journey of every kind of entrepreneur, right? It's started off selling sweets at school, as you do. So the reason I did that is because my parents wouldn't buy me a PlayStation, and everyone else had one. So I think it was when I was about 13, and at the time they're about 200 quid. So my uncle, who was the only entrepreneur I knew at the time, he ran a hotel. So I asked for his wholesale membership to a place called Booker. I went and bought loads of sweets that were really popular at the time.
Okay.
And then brought them back and sold them at school. And this is about year 8 or year 9. So you're kind of about 13, 14. At that time, you can't leave the school grounds for lunch. So I've got a captive audience. Right? I've got a captive market. And I made enough money within 2 weeks with a PlayStation. I thought,
wow, seriously?
This is pretty cool.
So the lesson for parents is don't buy them a PlayStation.
Yeah, basically. So that desire was strong enough for me to go out and do it. And that was pretty interesting. It evolved into lots of different things, a lot of experimentation. And then come to about 16, I was very interested, obviously, I was studying economics at the time, and very interested in disruption, right? So the internet has just changed the nature of business. In hindsight now, that effectively anyone can do anything because of the power of the internet, right? It's at everyone's fingertips in a way that business wasn't accessible before. And property was my go-to space at the time because it was so undisrupted, right? The internet had impacted retail with Amazon and hotels with Airbnb and social media and so on, but estate agency at the time was very, very, very archaic.
But so just to pause you there. So you're what, 16, 17, right?
Yeah.
When you're thinking about this. So at 16, 17, you're thinking the internet has disrupted these different sectors, but it hasn't yet touched real estate.
Yeah, pretty much. And
Okay.
it's largely because, and maybe we'll come on to this, but being a carer for my parents, we moved from Hemel Hempstead to Hertfordshire into London when I went to secondary school. And in that process, I wasn't fully aware, but in hindsight, I was aware of how little they did for what we paid them.
Okay.
So my parents are working so hard day and night for us to buy a home in London.
Yeah.
And they've taken whatever 1 or 2% of the property value of a Hertfordshire place for what, right? To show a few people around, really. So I thought that was a nice opportunity to get into that space, which was undisrupted, and started the first one at 16 called HouseSmart, which was you get an app on your phone. We got all the way to building the app, which was you take a picture or video of your house, and then you put it on a marketplace there, and you connect buyers and sellers directly. What I then realised is that's trying to cut out Rightmove, Zoopla, and estate agents. And for context, Rightmove alone is worth £6 billion now. So it was difficult. So after about a year of working on that, realised it was time to give up on that. And that pivoted then into Doorsteps, which was an online estate agency which maintained the human presence and human contact, but we effectively democratised the process by having local agents all across the country, working from home, going out to take pictures, etc., and then one central office. So the key thing was, instead of having the cost base of every high street office or presence, which in my view wasn't necessary, we then passed that cost saving on to the customer and charged £99 to sell a property.
Okay, so just tell us, how old are you when you switched from the first right move replacement to doorsteps?
So that was about 17, so during first/second year A levels.
Okay. So how were your A levels going?
Okay, actually, it was a lot of work, but I don't think I was as engaged in the process. Luckily, the grades came out okay, but it was for me. This was really a passion, and I think I realised that actually I was able to only manage the time because of how passionate I was about it. For me, it was almost a hobby.
Okay, I want to come back to this actually, but there's a question there about the implications for education, which I'd like to come to, and I mean parents may have a question about that as well. But just in terms of, sorry to throw this in the mix, but later in the interview to talk about what lessons you think the education system should be learning, particularly at sixth form, to be able to accommodate different potential career paths, including entrepreneurship. So let's park that for now.
Absolutely, yeah.
But just coming back to the journey. So first year A level, you've switched now to doorsteps, and then how long was that in the making?
So that was kind of building it over the course of second year of A levels. And that was just very, very basic things, getting a website up and a bit of market research. But the biggest thing for me at the time was our biggest competitor, called Purple Bricks, who are obviously fairly well known now. They floated on the stock market during my second year of A levels. And they went from inception to listing within, I think, 2 or 3 years. Wow. And that was unheard of in a estate agency, right? You've got the Foxtons and the Countrywides who took 50 years to do that.
Yeah.
And for me, that was it. I thought there's a market for this because people are obviously looking for alternative solutions.
Yeah.
Bearing in mind, estate agency was, and I think still is, the second most hated profession after politicians. Right? So it's not just a cost thing.
Worse than used car salesman, yeah?
Probably level terms, but that for me was that was screaming at me. I thought it's not just a cost issue. It's actually people don't like them. You're trusting these people with the biggest asset of your lives. And obviously it's not every single one, but generally speaking, they've got a poor reputation. So there was a problem to solve there, really.
Wow. Okay. So then, and then how long were you working on doorsteps for?
So yeah, after that first year during A levels, my focus was trying to get good grades as well, so that I could defer entry to university, which I did, which was kind of studying economics either at UCL or Oxford. That was the plan. Deferred entry for the first year. And then never went back.
Oh, you see how you just skipped you a year.
Yeah. So that was, given they're in a room full of Asian parents, I feel very apprehensive about saying that. But yeah, ended up being really engaged in the journey and ran that up until about 2 years ago.
Okay, all right. And then 2 years, that was an exit, was it? Did you sell? Or?
Yeah. So I left the business myself.
Yeah.
Because for various reasons. I think where the market was at the time and where my interests lied. So I took a step back from that. And about 6 months prior to me stepping away, obviously we'd gone through the pandemic. So during the pandemic, the government had the Kickstart program, which many might remember, which was Sunak's initiative.
Yep.
And I thought this is a really nice opportunity. I've got passion to support other young people or support employment, given the journey and how much I've learned in that time. This is the best way to get hands-on and get involved.
Yeah.
So I set up AKR, which was a social enterprise, which ultimately started off supporting the Kickstart program. So we were a partner with the government, delivered on that contract, and now that's just evolved into just being registered as an apprenticeship training provider.
Right.
So that's kind of what I focused on for about a year or so, and then wanted to move into technology, which is Impact 3.
Yeah, okay. So now tell us a bit about Impact 3 and that story.
So there's two kind of core businesses in that. One is One Club, which you mentioned, which is ultimately just having gone through that journey from 17 all the way to about 23 at the time. It's a very lonely journey, right? And I didn't have many entrepreneurs in the family, bar the one that I mentioned, my uncle. I didn't know other entrepreneurs, and it's a very, very difficult and volatile and lonely journey. So I thought, actually, why not build a community of people that can help each other, people that are on their own journeys effectively. So that's, for me, is a very much a long-term goal to try and bring people that are experiencing the same thing in a high performance way together, but also bring them together to solve societal problems on a social impact level. And the other business is called Eden, which is effectively in AI. So I won't go into too much depth, but it's in artificial intelligence, just because that way that's developed over the last kind of 6 months or a year.
Yeah. Okay. Fantastic. I mean, we see the impact of that, so everywhere already, not least in schools. But okay, fine, great, thank you. So with that, I just want to go in now, drop down into a couple of kind of key things in terms of not so much necessarily the kind of the business journey part of it, but the personal part of it. So you mentioned about your parents and kind of caring for them, and I've also seen you speak about that on a TEDx talk, I think it was, where you were speaking about that and how caring for your parents at that time was an important part of your personal journey. Can you give us a sense of what that was and how that impacted you?
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of the caring element or the journey itself, both my parents are deaf, and you'll see them over there. And I think that kind of caring journey, for me, it's a matter of, I didn't know anything else. So for most of my life, and to be honest, even to date, it's just how my life has been, right? And for them, and it's just how our family is. So I don't know any different. But I think with some reflection and kind of as my business journey has developed, I've realized actually there's a lot of benefits that have come from it, right? And it's been really important as part of my development as a person, and that I wouldn't have changed it for the world. Firstly, just a deep sense of gratitude, because and really actually being able to feel that, because they've had to put up with a much more difficult environment. They've had to, limitations in terms of access to jobs. My dad was born in Kenya, where there's no educational infrastructure for deaf people. Come to the UK, where even at that time, we're talking 70s, still no proper educational infrastructure for deaf kids in the UK. So, and still being able to get to a point where they've raised myself and my older sister, put food on our table, and actually done really incredibly well to give us everything we need growing up. So that sense of gratitude, not just I guess for my journey now, I almost see it as actually I've got it easy, right? I've got a roof over my head, I've got food on my table, so anything I do actually is really to go above and beyond, and that kind of sense of duty to give back and look after them, make sure that they've got everything they gave to me, but and beyond. And I think secondly, also, I guess in a more practical sense, certain skills like resilience, for example.
Yeah.
Right? I didn't realise, but you actually build a much thicker skin when there's things that happen where you've got to take more responsibility, and you've got to kind of grow up at 13 or 14, and mum goes into hospital, for example, and you've got to be there interpreting, communicating with the doctors. You kind of have to grow up a bit, and that sense of resilience. And I feel like I've got a much thicker skin because of that. And that ties into things like communication, right? Having to, I hate public talking, but I'm just so used to having to communicate on their behalf and empathize that you kind of just get into it. So all of those practical skills that I think actually ultimately were really helpful on the business journey. So I think, massively integral to my life now.
Okay, let's just explore that a bit more, because I think that's got so much relevance in terms of what we could learn. So there's a natural inclination often to avoid discomfort, or kind of difficult situations, or austerity, if you want to call it that. And what you're saying here is that that has its role, it has a purpose, it's the grit and the oyster type of thing. It leads to it can lead to a great outcome in terms of what you can take from it. But there's also the counter argument could be about protecting childhood, if you like, or protecting children, young adults from the responsibilities and pressures that they're going to be exposed to anyway as part of their journey. You were experiencing this from a very young age, and it seems like at a significant level, even in your early teens. How do you feel like in terms of that tension between trying to protect childhood and all of the things that you're trying to protect there versus actually this is something that you can grow from, and what could parents potentially take from that as a lesson?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the key thing to look at in my case was, and this comes to, I guess, something that I've looked at a lot more in the last few years from a philosophical standpoint, is Stoicism, right? Which ultimately, as we know, is driven by Vedic scriptures, but the dichotomy of control. So the main thing to understand is, can you control it?
Yeah.
In my case, no.
Yeah.
So then it's actually a matter of, and again, this is obviously not what I was thinking at 13, I wish I was, but this is all in hindsight. It's actually, can you control it? And I was lucky enough to have an older sibling who went through that, I guess, the adversity or a lot of the processes before I did, so was able to share that insight and make sure that I could take the positives from it. But it's, if you can't control it, what can you take from it despite it happening?
Yeah.
So, and again, the very cliched phrase, but it's not what happens to you, it's how you respond. And I think that response piece is really, really important. So in my case, I couldn't control it.
Yeah.
So given that, you can either dwell on circumstances, I wish I had this, I wish I had that. But for me, that just leads to a very absent life, right? There's a fundamental lack of fulfillment there. So for me, it was actually, I genuinely feel like I've kind of embraced the journey and actually like the journey I've been through, because it's reframing adversity, if we want to call it that, into a more positive mind frame and response. And the thing that I like to say, even to the team sometimes, or whatever it might be, is how can you make sure you're winning even when you're losing?
Yeah.
Right? So it's perspective. A perspective changes everything. We all see the world in a different way.
Yeah.
Two people could be looking at the same thing.
Yeah.
One person could be catastrophizing, this is the worst thing ever. The other person, and I think the story, I think it's Edison or someone else.
Mm-hmm.
His factory is on fire, and literally something he's worked his whole life for. His factory is on fire. And he calls his wife and kids and says, "Come, look how amazing this fire is." Right?
Yeah.
And it burns down and he rebuilds it. So it's perspective.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned Stoicism there. So like this idea, for those who may not be familiar, of self-abnegation, or withholding the impetus, or the move towards just enjoyment and actually being okay with self-restraint and duty and all of the things that come from that. And it's true, like these concepts are there. I mean, for me, they're very starkly presented in the Gita, in the Bhagavad Gita, where Krishna is speaking to Arjuna about these concepts. And one of the things you mentioned there about kind of the idea of maintaining control in a situation, and there's that dichotomy, not necessarily a dichotomy, but at least a thing that's going through our minds, which is like often where we're trying to control something, and then we also know that sometimes we just have to let it go because it's not within our control. And sometimes you can go quite far down that road before you find out that it's not within your control, right? And you can chase that many, many times. So it's always an interesting for me to see how people's think about that and approach that issue, as to how do you approach a situation when you're thinking about these things, a difficult decision or whatever it might be, a fork in the road, where you're thinking about, do I attempt to control this situation, or do I let it take its natural course well, if there is such a thing as a natural course, but you know what I mean, like let it take its course without my intervention. Like when you've gone through those points in your life, has there been something that has guided your perspective on that, or like even it may even be with regards to a business, like how like for example the very first business which you after a year decided actually this is a mug's game, kind of like trying to fight all of them at once, like, and you made a decision about that. So how far do you feel like you go down exploring an option before you make a call on it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in my case, and I still don't actually think I've mastered that, right? That's a really, really difficult thing
Yeah.
to master, especially in business circumstances where there's so many different factors, right?
Yeah.
It's individuals, the people running the business, the team, the market, the country, whatever else it might be, the economy, everything else. So I think it's, in my case, I think it's often down to gut as well.
Yeah.
So something almost at your core that says, this is not the right thing to be doing. And
Yeah.
because the flip side in entrepreneurship is persistence.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Persistence is key.
Exactly.
Whatever
Exactly.
it is, keep going, keep going, keep going. So trying to find that balance is really difficult. And I think that's actually where I think spirituality or the philosophy has come into it a little bit as well, is understanding that actually even understanding what's in your control and isn't actually as black and white as you think.
Yeah.
So there's sometimes a kind of a core gut instinct that says you've got to make a call, right?
Yeah.
And it's the opportunity cost of that time ultimately.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess, you know, I mean, obviously in terms of, you know, how significant is it, the thing that you're considering chasing after, and will guide that also. And but yeah, I find that's like quite an important thing for consideration, because I think my experience at least has been that over time, and I've had more of it than you have, over time, like I felt that you can become more confident in that intuition that you spoke about, just because you've seen it before so many times. So you kind of either you care less or you have more confidence in the intuition. Okay, so I'm gonna there was another point that I've heard you speak about, which is around identity and how you feel the importance of locating that identity, and being able to use that as a way to strengthen, I suppose, your place in the world and your contribution to it, etc. So can you speak a bit about that? I'm going to frame it like this, like in terms of the role that identity can have in growing yourself. And you know, we know that identity has a spiritual dimension to it at a fundamental level. But if you can talk through us, I mean, obviously touch upon that if you want to, but in whichever way that you feel that that's important.
So I think, yeah, definitely, I guess on a material level at least, I think something I've learned about identity is how much it actually matters. So I think one of my favorite books is called Psycho-Cybernetics, and long story short, it's written by a cosmetic surgeon who then got into neurology and deeper science of that, but started off as a cosmetic surgeon, and he moved into neurology because basically people came to him with very, very, very minor changes, right? Like the nose being moved up like half, not even like a millimeter, right? But their change in confidence after that operation, he would see a massive difference. And he thought, you look exactly the same. So he thought, it's actually the perception of yourself and that self-image. He realized that actually it's more the brain and the mind and more neurological than actually the physical change, right? So they felt more confident. They thought, oh, now it looks great. The thing that I thought was holding me back, my nose, now it looks great. I can go and conquer the world. It was really interesting because that's when I really thought about self-image. And if you take it back to, for example, in my case, I was playing football when I was a kid. Again, this is only in hindsight, but every time I take a free kick, I stand like Cristiano Ronaldo. Who doesn't, right? Why? Because your effectively trying to identify yourself as him. And actually, believe it or not, you're probably actually taking a better free kick because you're channeling that energy, right? So, and it goes down to the kind of the thought, belief, action, right? So even just your thoughts are so important because it leads to the beliefs that you have, and the beliefs that you have lead to the actions that you take. So, and it's actually been proven time and time again, people that regard themselves as physically fit actually go and work out more and do more exercise. And regard themselves as physically fit. So it's a cycle. So people say, "Oh, I'm not really a gym goer." What does that mean? You're actually limiting your. "Oh, I'm a bad driver." Well, actually, if you tell yourself you're a bad driver, you're probably going to be a bad driver.
They did an academic study on this. This is a good one for any of you who are in your exam years. So they had two sets of, so that kids about to take a serious exam, split them into two groups. One group, they said, for 1 minute, we want you to imagine that you're a football hooligan. So you just sit there in your exam space for 1 minute. You're imagining yourself as a football hooligan. And the other group, they said, we want you to imagine you're a university maths professor for 1 minute. They just, obviously, it's just pure imagination. But the difference in results was massive. And that was very interesting. Just exactly what you're saying, just the mindset or the self-image that you can create and the potential it has then. But please carry on.
No, 100%. That exactly right. And I think it's that story that you tell yourself that we often don't pay enough attention to, but actually is determining so much of what we do. And in my case, so I was 17 years old, knocking on doors, saying, "Oh, I don't really have a degree, but can I sell your house for 99 quid?" Like, it was hard. Like probably the first 6 months, it was just doors slammed in the face, phone being hung up on you, and I thought, maybe I'm not an entrepreneur, And then I actually again changing the thought process. Actually, no, I am an entrepreneur. Actually, I'm fairly academic. I can do this. And it's that story that you tell yourself that actually changes again how things work. And I think over time it's been really important because of a couple of things. So I think the talk that you mentioned, the reason I talk about identity there on a more macro level was because from a statistically speaking, as a young carer, I think it's 1 in 3 have poor mental health. As an Asian, we're generally disadvantaged from a mental health and career perspective. And as a free school meal pupil, I was, right? So a low income household. I think the average was half of free school meal pupils earn an average of 17 grand by the time they're 30 years old.
Wow.
Right? So if I identified with those statistics and said, "All right, that I fit in that box," that's a limiting belief that just stays with you. And I think that's something I'm a big believer in, especially for young kids or going through school. It's the minority ethnics or anything else that believe they're limited and almost have that preconception that they should only be at a certain level. And that's what I think needs to change with the identity piece. And I think on a micro level, it does come down to things like discipline. Oh, I'm not an early riser. No, I am an early riser. Get up early and get on with it. And no, there's discipline, you're a product of your habits, as they say. And I think especially with business, as you will know best, I think more than anyone, it's all of those little things add up.
No, that's brilliant. Fantastic. Okay. And I think, so in terms of that, the implications of that for business, I mean, the subject of this really is about how to grow yourself really to enable that growth of business. And I think there's that self-image, the story that you're telling yourself, what that means to you and the implications for you. And I'm just to kind of put a counter argument to that, in terms of the potential of taking that too far, or not too far, but maybe taking it out of context or in an inappropriate way, because we do see that sometimes occur, and sometimes even I've seen it occur prompted by parents. where the level of reinforcement it goes way beyond positive reinforcement, and I feel can set the psychology up of the child to be unrealistic, and not that we want to put limiting realism on a child's psychology, but in terms of just being too far gone. What do you sense a danger in that, or do you think that there's any way that we could constrain that to make sure that that positive image that we do want to encourage and help children fulfill is not rampant in a negative way?
I think it starts off as, I guess in my view anyway, it starts off as positive reinforcement or creating an identity for yourself. I think the thing that bridges the gap between where you are and the person you kind of want to become is, I guess, asking yourself that question. How would the person I want to become do the thing that I want to do now? Right?
Yeah.
So there's a case of positive reinforcement which potentially has no grounding, and there's actually acting in line with that. So the phrase I use is an evidence bank.
Yeah.
The thing that will stop you feeling effectively like a little bit delusional or an imposter over time is evidence, right? So if you can continue to deposit evidence into the evidence bank to say, actually, so if I say I'm a gym goer and then don't go for 6 months and never actually step foot in one, you're clearly delusional.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But if you've gone actually every week and then you've turned it into twice a week and 3 times a week, and eventually, actually you've used it in the right way, and you've deposited the evidence to show yourself, oh, okay, actually, I can do this. I am this person, and continue to reinforce. I think, for me, that disparity is evidence. So you still need to contribute evidence to yourself to reinforce that, rather than just telling yourself the story.
Yeah. And that's a really important, I feel, just in terms of its parallel in spiritual kind of journeys. It's very much the same. Like the idea that I'm a really spiritual person, but I don't do anything that's vaguely associated with spiritual endeavor or quality. And the notion that actually the positive reinforcement that goes into developing and living a spiritual life needs to be reinforced by evidence that supports that. I think that's a really nice parallel. Okay, so coming on to that then, in terms of spirituality, I know you've what's your engagements with spirituality in terms of its importance to you? What position or value does it hold to you? And we can then come on to like what value it then may have in terms of helping you in terms of your business perspective. But if we start from a personal, and then we can go onto the business side of it.
So I think just for context, I am very, very early in that, I guess, the spiritual journey, right? And it's a very complicated journey, but and I'm here to learn, right, from the likes of yourself and many others in this room as well. So for me, I think the value it's had over time, and maybe to give some context or pretext, growing up, I guess religion or spirituality, and maybe I'll conflate the two for now, but it was very ritualistic, right? It was very much go to the temple every couple of weeks, and I didn't really feel any sort of attachment, but I think because it was very ritualistic, right? Which I think is often the case with a lot of, especially British Asian families and of all different cultures. And then the curiosity spiked for me through the philosophy, because honestly, again, because of people like yourself and some of my dear friends who are very, very, very intelligent people, and were able to, what my perception was that actually it's very separate lives, right? You can live a spiritual life, or you can live an entrepreneurial life, or otherwise. When I saw the two come together, my curiosity spiked. I thought, wow, this is incredible. And then, as they say, I think it came at a time of, they say it's either curiosity, desire for wealth, or distress that generally brings you to spirituality. And I think for me, it was all three of them at the time. So I guess that's some context on how I started trying to get involved with philosophy, and this is only the last couple of years. I think the biggest thing for me initially, from a personal standpoint, if separately to business, was it helped me understand what personal development really was.
Yeah. Okay.
So what I mean by that is, for me, again, especially starting a business quite young, is my focus was what can I do to move the business forward? What can I do? Even if I was trying to develop myself, it was always in tandem with what drives the business forward. Or how can I do this, do that to make this better, that better? Actually, what I realized when I walked away from the business a couple of years ago is I almost lost my sense of identity because it was so tied up in the business. And I think spirituality, even just understanding the basis of the philosophy, I thought, actually, when all material possessions are gone and all achievements and this and that, it's just you and your character. That's all, at least in a material sense, all we've got is ourselves and the character. Who are we?
Yeah.
And that was left. I felt I wasn't nurturing the character enough. And that's where I think spirituality, from a personal standpoint, at least very broadly speaking, has been really important for me.
Yeah. Okay. That's fascinating. And and then in terms of, like your exploration of it, like you're saying, kind of over the last couple of years, and how you're thinking about and engaging with spirituality, in terms of how you feel that has or has it informed your business pursuit?
I think it definitely has. And actually sitting here was a nice opportunity to reflect on that, because it kind of gets entangled and you don't actually get a chance to reflect and say, how has it really made a difference?
Yeah.
I think firstly, and it kind of links back to the Stoicism a little bit, is the idea of equanimity, right? The idea of, I think we talked about it the other day, is tolerating happiness.
Yeah.
Right? Which sounds crazy, but tolerating happiness, I guess the principle or the concept is that it moves away from this sense of emotional volatility that, especially in business environments, is so easy to get it caught up in, right?
Yeah.
Things go really well, not overindulging in the successes, getting caught up in that and losing, again, that sense, I guess, that really core sense of self and good character. And also in the difficult times, a genuine sense of resilience.
Yeah.
So that sense of detachment from the outcome pushed me more towards a sense of duty.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And that's helped so much. So I see entrepreneurship for me as my duty, as to some extent from a Dharma standpoint, as my duty, as my service to the world. And in the same way, in terms of whether it's caring for my parents or in relationships or whatever it might be, I see them more as me being dutiful rather than a selfish endeavor.
Yeah. 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 And that's very much the message of the Gita. I mean, we have a small group where we discuss the Gita, and that's the message that you mentioned there about Krishna speaking about how happiness and distress come and go like the winter and summer seasons, and he's telling Arjun that we should tolerate that change, almost like the seasons. We should tolerate it and not be moved by that. And one of the things that we were discussing was that it's quite an interesting concept that Krishna is saying you should tolerate happiness. You don't normally tolerate happiness, you tolerate distress. So why is Krishna telling, we enjoy happiness, we tolerate distress. So why is Krishna telling Arjun to tolerate happiness? And one of the things there, which I think is really pertinent, is that it's very difficult if you're going through a difficult time in life and somebody says to you, just tolerate it. It's not the easiest thing to do. But if you tolerate happiness and you get good at tolerating happiness, then you can tolerate distress, or you can become better at it. So I think that's that mood of equanimity, as you said, Krishna uses that word quite a lot, the Sanskrit version, obviously, quite a lot in terms of the qualities of somebody who's on the spiritual path. And this approach of being able to engage your natural inclination, your nature, which clearly from you from a very early age, right? And I think in many ways you're quite fortunate from the perspective of that your whatever it was around your context and history and past that brought that out in you, but that natural inclination towards entrepreneurship was clearly evident early on, and you were, I mean, to your great credit, you pursued it with real determination, and Christian's message of like trying to find what that is, and then being able to engage in that in a dutiful way in the service of the world, and as a dedication to Him, in a dedication to your spiritual journey. I think that's a really powerful thing. It's an extremely motivating thing, and it's something which acts like a real guide for many people. So, I, the notion of trying to engage in that journey is sometimes, the doing of one's duty in the face of odds, and all of those things can well, it's difficult, isn't it? It takes that level of resilience and character, which is helped by some of the things that you've been speaking about. And I think being able to transfer that and what we might learn for that from, we were speaking about the education sector in particular. Like, so if we were taking kids in their GCSE years or their A-level years, and they were trying to find what is it that they have to contribute to the world? What is it that you felt as an entrepreneur? This is my thing, that I want to be an entrepreneur, and you caught that quite early. I find that many students, in key stage 4 and 5, so GCSE and A-level years, when they're having to make options that, at least at A-level, GCSE less so, but at A-levels that are sometimes going to determine the direction of their future studies and therefore career potentially. I mean, nowadays it's a lot easier to change, or maybe people are just more used to it. Do you have any advice or any thoughts on how somebody who's not, where they don't have that burning desire already within them, and they're trying to find out what that might be for them, and they're trying to, whatever it is, choose A-levels or maybe experiment with things, or any thoughts on how you might encourage or advise a 16, 17-year-old?
Yeah, I think it's a really, really difficult thing to do. And I am, as you said, so grateful that I'm in a position where I'm doing, even though it's very, very difficult at times, doing something I genuinely enjoy doing. And that is, I feel very, very lucky to be in that position, because as you said, it's not easy to find. So I think that came a lot easier to me. So very grateful for that. But even to some degree, I guess just touching on my own is, I've gone from property to recruitment to tech, right? So in theory, I think I understand the medium of what my service to the world is in terms of entrepreneurship. Yeah. And for me, that was just a very logical process. It was, how do you create, as one individual, how do you create disproportionate impact on the world? And that is, it's a business, right? It's an entity, because you have a group of people, and in your case, you're changing the lives of hundreds or thousands of students every day and month and year, because there's a team of people that support that mission, right? So that was, I guess, my thought process, but I don't know yet the specifics of what that looks like. I think in terms of someone that's maybe a bit younger, or 16 or 17, I think someone told me once about a Dharma test. Yeah. Which I can't remember all of the points, but I think one of them was, I guess at least in a working sense, or subject matter, is what doesn't feel like work. Right. What doesn't feel like there's a resistance, or what doesn't feel difficult to do. Yeah. And often that inclination is already the first step towards, this might be something that you can look at, right? So I think what doesn't feel like work, and for me, work doesn't always feel like work, for the most part. And I think I guess a subsection of that is in what space or what area can you deal with knockbacks in the best way possible.
Yeah.
So, for example, someone in sport, for example, right? I played tennis when I was younger. When I lost, I was like really disheartened. I thought, I can't do this. I'm terrible. This is pointless. And then when you get into business, the knockbacks I deal with are far, far greater now, but I can deal with them a lot better because I feel like I'm in my nature. So I think that disparity, I realized over time that actually, that's because I'm doing something.
And so just before, and did you have that response of, yeah, I can deal with this setback even when you were 16, when that first venture, did you feel that also then?
Probably not to the same extent.
Yeah.
Or definitely not to the same extent.
Yeah.
But I think it was almost a repeated process that I realized that.
Yeah.
So in my head, resilience is a muscle, right? So the more you train it, the
Yeah.
stronger it becomes and the better you get at dealing with these things.
Yeah.
And I thought the reason it's growing as a muscle is because I'm supposed to do this.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah.
And I guess going back to your question, I think it is a case of experimentation.
Yeah.
And I think what we can do as a society is try and give, when you're 16 or 17, obviously the academia is really, really important because it sets them up for the rest of their lives. But how do we create a safe space where they feel like they can experiment?
Yeah.
Because from an opportunity cost perspective, at that point in their lives, before they go on to have a marriage, kids, financial obligations, the ability they have to experiment drops massively.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because there's an opportunity cost, right? You can't sacrifice your family, your livelihoods, etc. So over time, I think the flexibility becomes lessened. So how at this point in time can we give them the opportunity to experiment and try and find that? And I think there's no pressure to find that immediately at 16 or 17, right? But at least have some inclination whilst they're in a safe space of school and with people around them.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I've heard it kind of framed, particularly, paraphrasing from the Gita, is this idea that, what comes really naturally to you, in terms of, what are you really good at naturally? What's a natural inclination? And what do you really enjoy? And the nexus, essentially, of those two things can point potentially to kind of one of these prototypical areas of contribution to the world. So, for example, wealth creation being one of them, the nature of entrepreneurship, etc. And others could be differently. And I've been thinking a lot about how can we try and create something based on these principles that would be able to act as almost a tool really for 15, 16, 17, 18-year-olds who are choosing subjects and degree choices to help guide that in a more structured way than it is right now, which is a little bit, I think, based on, I remember the career advice I got when I was in college, which started off with, what does your father do? And what does your mother do? And so it's not always well suited for the student in front of us. And but yeah, I think that's it's a really important thing for us, I think, to be able to incorporate within the system, the education system, because I think it's quite difficult, I think. And I think choices narrow very quickly in this country, like compared to, for example, in the US, where up until age 18, you're still studying a very wide spectrum of subjects, whereas here you're studying 3, maybe 4. And even in university here, you're specializing very quickly, whereas opposed to like majors and minors in North America. So I think that's a challenge for us in terms of the education system. Okay, I'm a little bit conscious of time, so I'm going to pause here because we always like to kind of leave, as you know, you've been here before, leave some time for questions, and I'm pretty sure there's going to be some tonight. So I'm going to look to our organisers to see if we have a roaming mic available, and okay, we do. So if you can please put your hand up if you do have a question, and just wait for the mic to come to you. So one at the front, please, to start us off.
Thank you. And actually, kudos to you. It's very impressive to hear you speak so eloquently. My question is, you talked about the sectors that your business, that you've been, you ventured into, the three that I know of at least just from hearing. And I'm intrigued about how you chose those sectors and how that cross-sects with your spirituality. Because there's so many, and yet you seem someone of such purpose. So how do you choose which is the ones you go to that don't, are not in conflict with your purpose? If that makes sense.
Thank you. It's a really, really good question. I think similar to what I touched on earlier, I think there is very much, especially given the property business was obviously very early on, I think there's the main driver from a spiritual perspective is how can you be of service to others, right? And I've not yet found, having again being very early on that journey, how that influences necessarily the sector or the type of business that I get into, right? Rightly or wrongly. So I think from a market perspective, it's, are you solving a problem? And actually what people again don't realize, and I didn't, is they're synonymous with each other, right? If you're looking at how you can serve others, actually you're probably going to find a problem in the market and therefore a solution and a viable business as a result. So for me, that was the case. So the property business, again, purely commercial, but we saved people, £20 million in fees. Great. If they can spend that on kitchens and cars and holidays, brilliant. The social enterprise, a bit more directly supporting young people because I felt it was at a time where that was necessary. And with One Club, same thing in terms of community driven, and the tech business in the same way. It's actually helping people to become more, in this case, productive in their roles. But for me, it's actually how can we make sure we're serving people? And for me, that's just like a baseline requirement. But that links very closely to what does the market need.
Can I just follow up on that question? Just there may be something also implicit in that, in terms of when you're talking about the conflict between, what may arise in a business context and potentially the ethical conflict that may arise when something may be in direct conflict. So I think if you're talking about something which is relatively benign in terms of a business sector, tech, well, actually, I won't say that. That may be relatively benign. Then you can look at it. You can look at just the upside or the outcome of the business as a contribution to society. But in other sectors, the actual intrinsic nature of the sector may come into conflict. I mean, you may not have had that experience directly yourself, but you can well imagine that being the case for many people who might be thinking about a business. And in that sense, where would you point to in terms of guiding principles for that potential ethical conflict?
Yeah, it's really interesting, and ethics is again not black and white, right? As much as it might seem it, and I think that comes down to what are your values. Yeah. Right, so I think actually having your own guiding principles in terms of values that you want to adhere to throughout, and I think that's also iterative. I've realised it's not you sit down and go, right, here's my values one day, and that's the values for the rest of your life. It changes in line with life circumstances and everything else, and the sectors you're getting into or whatever else it might be, the career you have. And then I think it comes down to that intrinsic motivation. What intentionality I think is really important. What are you intending as the outcome? Because we as a society often judge things purely based on the outcome and the externals, but we don't really think about what was the intrinsic motivation, what's the intentionality behind that. But then again, as you go with a deeper layer, the outcome or even the motivation or intentionality isn't very black and white, because you've got short-term outcomes or short-term motivation or short-term intentionality versus long-term, right? You might have a net outcome over 30 years that's very different from an ethical standpoint to what's happening or what sacrifice is being made in the short term. So I think there's various layers to it, but I think the guiding principles there and the intentionality of it and understanding that, I think is really important. And in many cases, for people that have spoken to an entrepreneurship and at the same time have a really strong spiritual backing, they've been very open and honest and say, this is just a commercial entity to make money. But how I use that money is where my spiritual backing comes. And rightly or wrongly, I don't know, but that's just, I guess, a different perspective I've heard before.
Yeah. No, I think it's a challenging one, but needs to be resolved at an individual level. But for sure, I think there are some guiding principles that can help us think that through for ourselves, I suppose. Yeah. Okay, great. Any others? Yeah, at the front.
So my question would be that in this day and age, does university education for the minority of people who have got academic level have a better, bigger goal as an end result, as an end game, compared to a person who may struggle because of aspirations of parents to the further education and actually not achieve a particular goal that was set by the parents or their mentors, and go into an apprenticeship where in 3 to 4 years he's actually ready to be at the top of his game, he's ready to start a business because the experience is over there. And having you as an example, not to disappoint the school, honestly, what would be your advice to parents where there is a child may do really well in an apprentice training college, right, as opposed to university?
Thank you. I think the biggest problem I think we've got at the moment is stigma. I think the perception of an apprenticeship or otherwise being lower than a university degree, when in fact you've got degree apprenticeships and things like that, right? And to be honest, I'm not, although it may seem like it, I'm not actually for or against, or I don't actually have any preference or deterministic outcome on either, what's better or worse. I think it genuinely does come down to the individual. And I don't think it's also conflicting with the academic process in schools either. I think regardless, and my view at the time was, if I do really, really well in my A-levels, I can then not go to university by choice, because if things don't work out in a few years, I can just reapply because my grades won't go anywhere, right? So there was no risk. So I think that principle still applies, I think, regardless. But I think it is genuinely, I think degrees are becoming more commoditized, because the access, if you look at compared to 50 years ago, it was a very small subsection of society that got degrees, and therefore the value was a lot higher because less people had them. Now, depending on the subject matter and so many different complexities, it's not for everyone. And I think trying to remove that stigma, to think actually people don't really care. And I know I've said that already, but I think it's just looking at 10 years' time. I think that helps really contextualize things from a standpoint, even if it's actually, and that goes to, if the business fails, actually in 5 years' time, no one really cares. And I think when you actually, and I think that does come from, and that for me, that's come from a spiritual point of view as well, to think actually there's so much more to the world and beyond the world. You are one tiny person, even on a material level. You're one person out of 7 billion people. You're the center of your own story, but probably not anyone else's, right? And I think that hopefully changes the perception or the stigma attached to say, actually, oh, my son didn't go to university, my daughter didn't go to university, they did an apprenticeship. But actually, if they're doing well in a few years' time, which if they feel comfortable and their career path is more practical, more hands-on, more appropriate for an apprenticeship, why not, right? And disclaimer, I don't have children, so I can't empathize. I wish I could. So I guess I'm just talking from my perspective.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the point there is really important. That it is. Obviously in Avanti we see like hundreds of kids going through that system, and many of our kids, several of those students, extremely highly performing academically, and chose to do the degree apprenticeship because. So, for example, one individual did it in a tech environment because they felt that was going to be able to better position them with regards to, rather than being in a purely academic environment. And I think it's true. I think it is. I don't think that we could easily place a right or wrong on this one. I think it has to be around the individual circumstances and what that individual kind of sees as their immediate next step. So. But I think at least now there is the option. I think it's taken some time, I think, to get the range of options in front of kids to be viable options. Because as you say, that stigma, even if the option existed, if the stigma is so strong, it's not really a viable option. And now what's happening is that you're getting other options which are very credible. And I still think that the degree apprenticeships are a step behind, because the top Russell Group universities are not behind them, and so you still do have some stigma attached to them, but it's certainly less than what it was, and is going in that direction. Okay, yeah, we've got somebody.
So just from both of your perspectives, what place do you think taking risks and voluntary taking on austerity difficulty has for people throughout their lives and careers?
Yeah, that's I think personal inclination and I guess personality will put people at different ends naturally of a spectrum in terms of how risk averse somebody may be, but I think that part of it is, so that aside, because that's something that you can't change other than through experience, education, and other things like that. But I think there is a social context for it as well. And I remember when I was doing my MBA, and one of the things that I learned about in the entrepreneurship kind of module that I was taking at the time, it was quite an interesting piece of fact. So they were talking about the difference in attitude. So they were talking about Silicon Valley and how Silicon Valley has become like this engine for entrepreneurship and risk taking. And they were talking about how London was falling behind on that comparator in terms of a place of innovation. So one of the things that entrepreneurship and risk taking requires is a ecosystem to foster that entrepreneurship. And part of that ecosystem is about access to capital. So when you need access to capital, either you're going for somebody to invest in your business or lend you money or whatever it might be. So in the US, they have the banks have a certain approach, and the approach is that essentially we are more likely to lend you money if you've already been bankrupt before. Now, in the UK, it's the opposite. We're less likely to lend you money if you've been bankrupt before, because there's a different understanding as to what it is that you've learned or not learned, or I can learn from you being bankrupt. So the UK version is, you've been bankrupt before, you're more likely to be bankrupt again. The US version is, the Silicon Valley version is, you've been bankrupt before, you learned from your mistakes, you're less likely to be bankrupt again. So now, like, if we just play that out in terms of what that means to us, in terms of the nature of risk and how we're willing to engage with risk, that's an important lesson, right? Like, because like, if I feel that if I fail in this attempt, I'm going to be better or worse off as a result of that failure. So clearly, if I think I'm going to be worse off as a result of that failure, my risk aversion spikes, right? Like, I don't want to do that, like, because there's too much at risk. There's a high opportunity cost, as Akshay was saying. So like, but if I think I'm going to be better off, that positions me very differently. So I think, like, for me personally, and from a personal example, I took a big risk. The first big risk was probably at university. So I was in my first year med school. Government was trying to close down the temple. I wasn't at the time particularly attached to the temple, but I didn't like the idea of the government trying to close down the temple. So I got involved with that. And for me, that was worth the risk. I got kicked out of med school. Downside, extremely glad I did, because I then saw my kind of wife, future wife at the time, going through that and thinking I could never have done that. But I think, but at the time, it's like, people talking about parents. You should have seen my parents when I was kicked out of med school. But the thing is that I knew that, look, there's something here which is too important to not take a risk for. So I think for me, there's these two things going on simultaneously. One is how important is that thing that you're chasing after, And the second is, what's your perspective? Do you think that you're going to be better or worse off as a result of failure from that risk? And I think that, unfortunately, well, not necessarily, okay, just in a, before I hand over to Akshay, just one last point that, when my parents and, I think many of us in the room will share the experience that a lot of parents, that first generation that came across from East Africa, came to this country, you can imagine that their risk profile was very different. Their risk profile was, if this doesn't work, I've got no food on the table, right? To your point, I have no roof over our head. That's the level of risk. Second generation doesn't, well, it may have, but it's less likely to have that level of risk. So the second generation has the, if you can say, like a higher degree of comfort that enables them to say, okay, if things go wrong, to your point, what's the worst that's going to happen, right? I'll go to university a year later, right? So I think that is that's a sort of asset or wealth that those younger generations have, which if they don't make use of, are wasting. So if you have that potential to do something like to follow something which is inherently calling or that is really important to you fundamentally, they have the ability, the pragmatic ability to be able to pursue that in a way that other older generations didn't necessarily have. So that's, from my perspective, the sacrifice that was made at that first generation level has enabled a lot of, but if we waste that asset that's been built up, then that's a real shame.
Everything he says. Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. I think talking from a perspective, I guess, of the second generation having been born, or lucky enough to be born in the UK as well. But I think from my perspective, I guess, to try and offer a different perspective as well, is around, goes back to what I was talking about before around perception. So I think a lot of it's already been touched on, but there's a book called Black Box Thinking, which effectively explains that failure or success is a direct result of failure through the learning and iteration along the way. So again, it's how you perceive that failure, how you utilize it, right? So I think Unilever, on most of their products, use a nozzle. It's been shown that came as a result of 449 attempts. Point being is they iterated every single time 449 times until they got to the outcome. So if you perceived success to be as a direct result of failure, again, your attitude to risk as a result changes quite dramatically, taking into account, of course, the opportunity cost and the context as well. And this might be a bit idealistic, but the way I see it is, if I didn't have failures and if I don't have failures in the future, of course, the extent to those will vary, but I can sit here, my story won't be that interesting. The story you've got to tell when you look back at 50, 60, 70, 80 is what makes that story really interesting. And that might be a bit of a crazy way to view it, but for me, it's part of the journey. It's what makes it exciting.
Yeah, I think that's a super important point. This idea of, the youth group's motto of a life less ordinary.
Yeah.
And that's the potential.
I think one of the, another book I was reading actually, it says to be, and I think it uses it very patronizingly, so I wouldn't use it in this context, but to take a bit out of context for a second, is to be average is to return no interest on God's investment in you.
Yeah, nice. Great. How are we doing on time? Ooh. One more question. Thank you.
My question is kind of on, I guess, with spirituality and business, obviously you shared this kind of it's not black and white. So is it not easy to just keep business and spirituality as our own kind of personal journey?
Me? Yes, and I think that's how I perceived it several years ago, and to some extent still trying to work out what is the blend between the two. But I think fundamentally, the spiritual journey is about understanding yourself. And the biggest determinant of any change in any business is ultimately the people in it, right? So I think there's an inextricable link there that you can't actually detach the two, because your growth as a character, or your understanding of yourself, your consciousness as an individual, and that journey will inherently impact your business, whether you like it or not. So if you try to keep it separate, and again, I might be wrong, I'm trying to use foresight here, but from that understanding or that premise, my view is that it's impossible to de-link on that basis. But I think you probably have.
No, I think that's, I just to add to that really, I think there's the what you're doing, and then there's the who you are and what you're bringing as a consequence of who you are to what you're doing. So I think not everybody, like I feel like I'm really fortunate in the sense that what I'm doing involved in education in the spiritual multi-academy trust, which is quite unique, doesn't conflict, or not just doesn't conflict, but is completely in line with my spiritual pursuit. But I've also been in contexts where what I'm doing is not necessarily either conducive to or supportive of my spiritual pursuit. But I think the important thing is that in that context where there is a challenge, I mean, look, Krishna is speaking the Gita on the battlefield. I mean, that's not a very conducive, externally speaking, that's not a very conducive space to bring spirituality. But it is also within that very conflicting environment, to the point that Akshay was making earlier about resilience and what that draws from an individual, where, that is, like I was saying earlier, that's the grit in the oyster, right? That's the thing that will also help bring about and nurture and mature your spiritual outlook. Because if you can be spiritual in that context, then you can be spiritual anywhere. And I think that's, to the point that you're making, right? Like, it's about how do you view that situation? Is the cup half empty or half full? So, yeah, it's. I think that's one of the beautiful things I find about that teaching of the Gita, which is the idea that there is no material condition that can limit spiritual life. There is no material condition that can limit it. So as long as we are approaching it in a sincere and genuine way, that spiritual maturity and journey can manifest regardless of whichever material situation we find ourselves in. Okay, I think that was the last question. So thank you so much for your attention and being with us. Thank you, Akshay, for being with us. It's fascinating evening. I'm sure really, we all learned so much, and you gave us a really beautiful insight into your own journey and what we can take from that. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay.